So now we're going to bring in Linda Way Valakazi, I'm going to turn the program over to her. She's our health reporter, and she will introduce our next guest.
Thank you so much, Denise.
Thanks, Lindy. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. So today we'd like to shed some light on the mental health challenges of today's Black children and youth and how the parents and adults in their lives can provide the support that they need to be mentally healthy. So joining us today, we have Dr. Colby Tyson with us, who's the Associate Medical Director of Inpatient Psychiatric Services at Children's National Hospital here in DC, where she works with youth hospitalized in the inpatient psychiatric units. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tyson.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me here today.
Absolutely. So regarding your work at Children's National Hospital, when you look at children specifically, what are you seeing of the issues that are coming through your doors? And how may some of these issues vary based on a child being Black in the district?
No, absolutely. And that's a great question. I'm really glad we're talking about this because our youth are navigating significant struggles related to their mental health. And really in a world with significant changes, stressors, and quite frankly, unfiltered accessibility that creates a whole different type of vulnerability that maybe previous generations have not had. So when we look at the issues that our youth are dealing with, well, first, it's hard to encapsulate that in just a few words, but I'll try. But essentially what we're seeing is we're seeing more youth, number one, just even coming into the emergency room for mental health needs. And then we're seeing a higher amount of them requiring psychiatric admission. Then on top of that, once they're here, what we're seeing this increased level of severity in what they're dealing with. So we're seeing higher levels of suicidality. We're seeing suicide attempts outside the hospital, but also inside the hospital now. We're seeing higher levels of violence, aggression, severe anxiety, sometimes to a point where they struggle with even going to school and lots of school refusal, isolation. I think something that's standing out even more is that we're not just seeing suicide connected to longstanding difficulties where we have all these warning signs leading up to it. We're also now seeing teens with no formal psychiatric history who are just struggling to cope with what's going on in the world, feeling alone, dealing with bullying, intense stressors, trauma. And suicide has now kind of become this way of solving this problem and this overwhelming distress that they're dealing with to end these painful emotions. So we're seeing a lot of that. And then on top of that, severe substance use. So we take that and look at that in the context. So the issues that we're seeing they're dealing with in the context is uncertainty of their future. As our country is dealing with political, legislative changes, things related to LGBTQ plus rights, women's rights, racial inequities, systemic racism, gun violence, school shootings, and just kind of list goes on and on. Then you add on top of what kids are dealing with, the trauma, the poverty, family conflict, lack of appropriate resources, and investment in mental health. So that's kind of what we see as the issues. And then if we kind of go into the Black community, they're dealing with all of this. And then on top of that, we also know there's disparities, that there's evidence for that within the systems that also affect their mental health. So this is related to accessing mental health care, accurate diagnoses, right? Some youth are more likely to get a certain diagnosis when they present with psychosis versus others. We also know disciplinary action versus referral to mental health care within the school systems. All of this continues to contribute to the mental health of our Black youth. And so we are now also seeing increasing rates of suicidality in our Black youth rapidly increasing. So those are the issues that we're seeing in general and also down into the Black youth as well.
Wow. No, I thank you for that answer because when you explain that, it sounds like there's an underlying consistency of trauma that so much of the youth is experiencing. A lot of people experience loss during COVID, a host of issues that were exacerbated during that time, and it just continues now. When we see the rising level of gun violence around our communities, people who are losing family members, whether it's natural causes or health disparities, is there anything that sticks out to you in how you see children and youth respond to death, whether they're experiencing loss in their families or seeing death around them in their communities?
Absolutely. So we know that navigating death, loss, grief can be very unique to the person, and everyone processes these things in a different way. And it can be very complicated for youth based upon what their lived experience to date has already been. And so when we look at even death within the family right? This can stir up all types of emotions. It can be guilt, rage, sadness, hopelessness. There can be some relief. And many times it's all mixed up together for a youth to try to figure out, how do I understand this and what's going on with me? It can be overwhelming. There's also what I've noticed that stands out is this experience of the loss in the day-to-day within the family dynamics that sometimes we don't pay attention to, right? A lot of times the person who we've lost in that family had a specific role, whether they were the mediator, the protector, the confidant for that child. That role is now vacant in that child's life, and they're scrambling, trying to understand how they move through big milestones in their lives. So one of the things I really want to remind people is that grief is not just right after the event. It will come at different milestones in a child's life when they're noticing that person would have been here or this role would have been filled. And so we see that. But then we also know that death can also affect the community. And within a community, it can bring up similar emotions to an individual because it reminds them of different situations close to them. We also know that it can bring fear into a community, depending on how that death occurred, and fear that a child might lose someone else in their life. But then we also have to acknowledge that there are times where death is a day-to-day experience for some youth because they see it every single day, whether it's due to violence, whether it's due to illness, and to them, they can come off more disconnected to it. And just matter of fact, this is what life is. So every youth experience is different, and we have to keep that in mind when we're working with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've also seen widespread concern of the rising crime and also rates of youth violence in the city. And I've just always under the belief that there's typically some underlying issues that are happening, usually from the family unit or just their home life in general, that kind of encourage negative mentality or behavior in adolescent life. So what are some of the background circumstances that you're seeing in young patients that may negatively affect their levels of depression or anxiety or even adverse behavior?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You see a lot in the youth that we work with. And so some of what I've seen that definitely we see negatively impacts their mental health outcomes: poverty within the family household, lack of access to just even basic needs, right? I'm thinking about some of my patients who were trying to support them with their mental health, but there's no electricity, and that's interfering with their sleep, which is affecting their bipolar disorder and causing them to go into a manic episode, right? It all can connect. We see lack of their ability to be engaged in activities that support mastery outside of just the school setting, right? Some of our youth struggle academically, but that's the only thing that the world is focused on is, are they smart enough in school? But we're not looking at mastery in other areas of their life to help build their confidence and their esteem. So we see some of our youth not having access to that or not being able to be engaged in it. Lower level of supervision in the home. And this is not just because the parent is neglectful, right? This is sometimes because the parent is working 3 or 4 jobs, working overnight to kind of manage that economic stress that the family is dealing with. Or they are dealing with their own mental health or their own physical health that they're navigating as well. We see a lot of trauma within those families that have gone through generations that then affect kind of how the youth and the parent are interacting and the conflict that then come in it. So those are some of the different things that we'll see that can affect our youth's mental health, but it's within the family, kind of bubbling underneath the surface, that we got to also pay attention to.
Sure. Sure. And, when you're working with the youth, every approach varies depending on the child that you're working with. But are there any baseline tips or practices that you introduce to children to kind of help them manage their mental and emotional health, whether it is depression or anger, or just what kind of things can they take with them to practice?
Yeah. So you're right. Every child's treatment is unique in how we approach and how we work with them. But when I look at some of the baseline things I want to really help our youth walk away with, especially when they come to see us in the hospital, number one is first self-validation, and how we first acknowledge that what you're feeling, what you're experiencing can make sense in the context of what your life and your world and your environment looks like and your experiences you've had to date. Because sometimes our youth are walking around feeling like no one understands them, feeling like they're wrong for having these emotions, feeling like people are telling them, just be happy. Why can't I be happy? So some of the skills we first just start off with is, how can we just validate what you're experiencing is real and make sense and make understanding of it for you, to then figure out, then how do we start recovering? How do we start healing? So we do that through a variety of different ways, kind of looking at emotions, getting our teens to talk about emotions, trying to teach them how do we lean into your emotions to understand what is it communicating, as opposed to how do we, as opposed to avoiding them and not understanding them. So those are some of the initial skills. We'll also talk about what are your overarching goals, what's important to you, because some of our youth have been handed a life that has been stressful and traumatic from the start. So how do we help you identify what would make it worth being alive? What would be important to you? And then how do we look at what does that look like in recovery? So we talk to youth and we help them kind of think about those things. And then on top of that, building in different relaxation techniques, mindfulness techniques, education about what is going on with them. So there's some of the things we try to help our youth with. And if you really look at the overarching theme, I would say is we're trying to reinstill hope, because this process takes time. Depression and anxiety does not go away overnight. So instilling some level of hope to have them hold on and use different skills to manage is what we like to do in general with our youth.
Awesome. Healing is definitely a process, and being able to relearn how to pattern your life based on what you've experienced before. So understandable. And before we let you go, in terms of the parents and the adults around them, what can parents and other adults who are involved do to help balance their children's mental and emotional health? And are there certain things that parents can look out for to gauge and address how their children are feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's going to sound more simple than what it is, because it's actually quite challenging, because as caregivers and adults, we are also human. We also have our own emotions. We have our own experiences that influence how we view stress and how we cope with stress. And so I would say the first thing I talk to parents and caregivers about is, how do we make sure your narrative does not become your child's narrative, right? And that means you have to listen to them first. Even if you don't agree, listen to what they're experiencing, hear how it is in stress before we try to fix it, before we try to tell them our stories of, well, you should be able to do this because I did this, because our world is different than ours was. So really talking to parents about what does it mean to listen and validate that child's experience, that it is different, hearing that other perspective, and then also trying to help them lean into emotions, not telling them just things, you should be happy or this needs to get fixed, helping them understand these are real emotions, because life is full of both beautiful, wonderful experiences and stress and struggles. And we have to help our youth learn how to tolerate and navigate those things. So I talk to parents about how to just listen. And then on top of that, creating space for them. And so finding time to just connect with your youth. It doesn't mean you're asking them constantly about their mental health, but just having that space available where you're spending time with them. So if something's coming up, they can share that with you. They can bring that up with you. And then also just as caregivers, acknowledging that we're not perfect and that we may need support ourselves to support our youth, right? There are things we've experienced as adults that are influencing the choices we make for our youth. And it's okay to say that we need support too. So in that, as far as what parents can do or what to look for, kind of looking for youth when they might be isolating or they might be kind of rebelling or behaving in ways that don't make sense. That should be a signal to you. If they're behaving in ways that don't quite make sense to me, perhaps it's not that they're a bad kid. Perhaps it's not that they're just trying to make my life more difficult. That might be a sign that something is happening with your child, or there's something they're not understanding about themselves that they're trying to navigate. And so using that as a warning sign. Also, we're noticing them isolating, or if they're changing behaviors, things that they used to enjoy and like to do, if they're seeming more confused, or if they are, sometimes teens are telling us in different ways, I'm having a hard time. And when they're telling you, you're stressing me out, well, maybe that's all they know how to explain to you. But instead of taking that personally, saying, okay, what are the vulnerabilities in my child right now? What are they dealing with that's making them more vulnerable in this state, to help them address that? So those would be some of the suggestions that I would have for parents and caregivers.
Awesome. I appreciate your insights so much. This has been so informative, and we hope to have you back soon, because we definitely plan to continue to talk about this issue and how we can help our youth. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Tyson.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to being back.
Absolutely.